The act to abolish slavery was passed in 1833, and it was put into practice in 1834. So this church was actually built the same year as that. Now, this area, so Leyton and Leytonstone, were considered to be part of one area really, and the area was called a pretty retiring place for gentlemen. This was not as it is now. This would have all been countryside, not like it is now, just countryside. And the wealthy, mostly men, gentlemen, who made their money from the transatlantic slave trade and the East India Company, they would come here in Leytonstone, Essex, to retire or to live. They would build their mansions, or they would buy a mansion, and they would live like country gentlemen, and they would live here. So the area has lots of these mansions still around. Sometimes they're converted for other uses. Some were knocked down, but there are still quite a few left around. Who's heard of, because I used to work for adult education, who's heard of the Chestnuts Adult Education Centre? That's one of those mansions owned by people who were involved in the slave trade. Who's heard of Leytonstone House? Just up the road there. It's now Tesco's, but it's one of the oldest mansions around. And the people who lived there were people involved in the abolition movement. There was a man called Samson, and then there was the famous Buxton family who lived there too. So that's the area it was, okay? So like I say, this walk is going to take us just up the road there slightly. We're going to cross the road and come all the way back down. But we're now just going to do a walk around the graveyard to take a look more at what's going on. So follow me and we'll stop. This is important when they put this up, because it does give you an idea of what the area would have looked like over time. And particularly if you look at this one here, you get an idea of kind of this one here, the countryside feel to the borough, to Leytonstone. Even in the early 19th century, it would have been very much countryside. Only, as you say, with the Industrial Revolution, suddenly you've got, and migration is nothing new. So you have migrating into this area agricultural workers, white agricultural workers, who no longer had work in the countryside, further parts, this was Essex, but further parts of Essex. So they would look for work by coming here. So migration is nothing new. And of course, then you have the wealthy who suddenly would be moving out because it was no longer the countryside. So they no longer wanted to stay here. They would sell up and move out. And property developers would build all of these terraced houses, the Victorian terrace houses that we see would be built by property developers. So then you have this sort of mass working class community again coming in, and they would have been Irish, there have been many, many different people coming in for work and for housing and things like that. So migration is nothing new at all, and we see it all the time. Okay, so if you want to have a quick look at that, feel free, but we're gonna move along. This is the family grave of one of those wealthy people that I talked to you about. And this is the Cotton family, and they moved and lived in this area, and they were extremely wealthy. Their wealth came from, I think it's a man called Joseph Cotton, who worked for the East India Company. And that's where he got his wealth from. I mean, there was huge wealth made by the East India Company, as probably you know, in terms of exploiting India. And that meant his family became very, very wealthy. They were involved in the end in becoming governors of the Bank of England, in becoming some of the people who established the East India Docks. Don't forget, the empire, the British Empire is developing at this time, and lots of goods are coming from India, other parts of the world, and there's no place though, they can't unload them quick enough in the docks. There's a lot of theft going on, which they don't want. That affects their profits. So they wanted to build these special docks where the goods would be unloaded very quickly and they would be safe and secure. And so you have the development of what was known as the East India Docks, and later, and then the West India Docks. And this family were involved very much in the East India Docks. Capitalism is an international thing. So if you're involved in the East India Company, you want to make money, you're going to get involved in the transatlantic slave trade, because then you're going to make even more money. And the East India Company was involved in enslavement of other people, not just by investing in the transatlantic slave trade, but in fact in India. So they would encourage others to kidnap people from Africa, bring them to some of the islands just off India, where they would then be forced to work there, whether it be sugar and other things like that. And in fact, when the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, there was a special indemnity, I think, given to them, East India Company. They could prolong it for a bit longer. But I mean, due to pressure being put on them, they had to stop in the end. But they didn't voluntarily stop. They were making a lot of money and they wanted to continue doing so. So that was also important. So there we have Joseph Cotton, the Joseph Cotton family based here. And they would have lived, I think there was a famous place called Walwood House. It was on Walwood Road. But along Walwood Road presently now, that would have been part of Walwood Estate. And the mansion would have been there, and then it would have been sold, and then speculative developers would have then built their Victorian houses on it. So you've got people here who have a very strong vested interest in continuing the British Empire, in continuing the transatlantic slave trade. And they would have been quite a strong lobby on the British government and others to ensure that that continued. But I want to take you to also later on see one of the abolitionists, members of the Buxton family, and you can see the difference there as well. But I'm also going to talk about, as was said earlier, about this hidden history of African people who came to Leytonstone as well. And I want to talk to you about them. But first, we're going to move along and get to the Buxton family grave. With industrialization, you get the destruction of nature anyway. The wealthy weren't stupid. They knew what was coming and they moved out further into Essex, Suffolk, Sussex, Norfolk. And so, but these spaces here now are very, very important, precious open spaces. Now this tree here, it's an oak tree. Any idea why an oak tree has been planted here? What is the significance of oak? During the British Empire, and before then, of course, oak was the tree that was used to build the ships. The ships that were part of the transatlantic slave trade were made of oak. You have the royal oak, the old oak of England. That was the idea. Oak was a very important tree in this country. And it was that tree. This tree was planted in 2007 as part of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade. And there is a plaque just here that tells you about it as well. And again, I think that if we're thinking about how do you represent those horrors, I think this is probably a very good way of doing it. But it is reminding you about what happened. Now, while we're here, there's another plaque there. This area is very different from the other areas, isn't it? There are no gravestones here. Any ideas why there are no gravestones here? Well, because the Second World War, the fight against the Nazis, and part of the Blitz that took place, bomb fell here. And of course, it destroyed all the Victorian gravestones that were here. So it's just open land. And you'll find that George Tomlinson School, that site was also the site where a bomb fell in that area. And there were other sites as well. But obviously what they did was they just moved all the gravestones away. I don't know if they moved the bodies, but certainly moved the gravestones away. And so it's very much an open area, very distinct from the other areas where you can actually see gravestones, things like that. But that's why. And we come back again to that struggle against oppression, against racism. And here we have a struggle against fascism, Second World War. And we're back to it, unfortunately, today. And we understand why it's so important that we struggle against fascism, because we've seen what happens, how Jewish people were scapegoated because there was poverty, there was unemployment in Germany and elsewhere. And so obviously those in power decided it was very good. Let's scapegoat other people. It's them over there that are causing it. Like it's migrants now. They're responsible for all these terrible things. And let's just pick on them. And we have the same thing there. The Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism. It was already there. And they just built on that and built on that in order to spread fear and anger and hate. So it's so important that we stop it, because these are fascists. They're under no illusions of who is around here now. Those people that were going to the hotels, that were putting up the flags and daubing the Red Cross, rather than say, well, it's unemployment is caused by an economic system. It's these minorities over there. It's Muslims. They're the ones. Look at them. They're terrible. Look at all the things they're causing. And that will deflect people away from directing their anger at the right source. And that gives the opportunity for fascism to grow and develop. I think it is important that we realise that, and therefore we understand the importance of the work that, as I said, Leytonstone Against Racism are doing. We need to fight back now. We can't wait till we get far right in government, Nazis in government. Now, it is getting overgrown. So if you're brave and you've got trousers on, you might want to go and take a look at the Buxton family grave. The Buxton family are very important. They lived in the mansion called Leytonstone House, and they were very much part of that much more radical tradition. They were against the slave trade, so that was quite important. So there were quite a few Quakers. They became Quakers by marriage. They married into the Elizabeth Fry's family. Her headstone is at the Wanstead Friends meeting place. Her headstone is there. So they married into the Quakers, and that kind of opened them up to a much more radical tradition. But they were essentially C of E, and that's why they're buried here, because this was their local church. When it was built, it was their local church. So they were C of E, and the C of E were very much, to start with, pro the slave trade. Don't forget, the C of E was the official church. It was the church of the establishment, and therefore they absolutely supported enslavement and the British Empire. But there were people like this who were against it. And in Parliament, obviously, the leader of the parliamentary abolition movement was a Buxton. Let me get his picture. Sir Thomas Farrell Buxton. That was he didn't live here, but this was part of his family. He may have visited, I don't know. But certainly they were very much against the slave trade. The Berkeley family used to live here. So you can imagine the wealth that was in this area. The banking family, they lived around here. So that gives you an idea. That gives you an idea of the wealth that was in this area. So let me give you a picture of Sir Joseph Cotton as well while I'm here. Now, he's not buried here. He's buried at the parish church of Leyton, which is now called St Mary's Church. It was countryside, and they couldn't travel all the way from here to the one in Leyton because it might flood, it was overgrown, all the rest of it. And not everybody had horses and carriage. And what's also important is that you'll notice that there were quite a lot of children, and they died very young. They didn't have access to the clean drinking water. So people would drink beer. So the Buxton family were involved in brewing and in beer, and that made them a lot of money. It's Hanbury, Buxton, Truman and Co. And that's where they made their money, because it was much better to drink beer, which had gone through a process, to clean it and sort it all out, than drinking the local water. This is really important panel. This is put up by the local council, and it does tell you about the history of the high road. What it was originally like. Again, look at that sort of countryside feel to it. And this is more like, this is in 1914. So you can see the rapid industrialization of the railway and the contrast of the area, okay? What I want to bring you here, though, is I want to talk to you about that hidden black history of the area. I've been working with the church to get permission to put up a number of plaques towards people of colour who came to Leytonstone. Her name is Princess Aina Sarah Forbes Bonetta Davis. She was a princess in West Africa. Okay. What happened? This was again during the time of slavery going on in Africa, and there was a power struggle between two states. There was the Oyo Empire, a vast empire in West Africa, now covers parts of Nigeria and things like that. And then you had the state of Dahomey, which is now Benin. And there was a power struggle between both these places. And what happened was that there were these what's called enslavement wars, because obviously during the time of the slave trade, the Europeans were encouraging these states to go out, kidnap people, and take them to the coast so they could then be transported to the Americas. And even though the British said, right, we don't want to do that anymore, some of these states had found that the rulers felt they made a lot of money from it, and therefore they didn't want to stop doing it. And so the British would send their naval forces out there to try and encourage some of these states to stop the slave trade, which they had started in the first place. And then they were now telling them, please stop it now. We don't want you to do it anymore. During one of these wars between these two states, Princess Aina was kidnapped. Her family were killed. She was kidnapped. She was taken to Dahomey, where she was going to be killed. 5 or 6, she was kidnapped. The British naval fleet went out there. There was a captain, I think his name, Captain Forbes. He went to speak to the king of Dahomey and say, look, Empire would like you to stop doing this. He said, I'm not going to stop doing this. I'm making too much money. Or words to that effect. I wasn't there at the time. So, but what he did say was, he said, look, give her to your Queen Victoria, as a present from us. And so he took her as a present. And so he named her after himself, Forbes. He named her after the ship that she was on, which was the Bonetta. And originally they took her to a place called Sierra Leone, which was a British colony. Members came here. And members of the abolitionist movement set up the Church Missionary Society. The idea was, what they wanted to do, what the abolition movement wanted to do, almost the 3 C's: commerce, civilization, Christianity. They believed, they were opposed to the slave trade. They wanted to replace it with what they called legitimate commerce. That meant trade with the British Empire. That was their idea of legitimate commerce. They wanted to replace the indigenous or the faiths of the people there with Christianity. They felt Christianity was the superior faith. So we want to convert them to Christianity. And then civilization. The idea was that British civilization was far superior to the civilizations in Africa or Asia or anywhere else. So they want to convert people to their civilization, the 3 C's. Okay? And so they took this young girl, traumatized young girl. She was in Sierra Leone for a while, then she came to Britain. She was introduced to Queen Victoria, who said, well, she can be my goddaughter. She heard the story and said, she can be my goddaughter. Yes. Yeah. And therefore she said, she will look after her. Yeah. And that's what they did. They looked after her. But in a way, they would say that, look what we've done. She now reflects the 3 C's. She's now a Christian. She now supports British commerce. They molded her into the kind of person they wanted her to be. And they saw that as a success story. Isn't this a success story? This is what we can do in Africa and Asia and everywhere else. And they can all be just like us, by the color of their skin. Isn't that going to be wonderful? And that's what they did. But she actually came here. She came to visit the Buxton family in Leytonstone House in 1866 with a number of other African people and members and missionaries as well, white missionaries. She came with about maybe 6 or 7 other black people to visit. Because as I said, the Buxton family were very much involved in the missionary movement and the abolition movement, as were members of this church. The church was quite important for that movement too. So I'm looking to get a plaque up to her. The next are 2 men. And again, I want to show you a picture of them again. There we are. The 2 African men. One of them is called Abdullah Susi, and one of them is called James Chuma. And they worked with Dr. David Livingstone. And this is the thing, it's that hidden history. Thank you. You don't hear about these African men and women. We hear about David Livingstone. But without them, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did in Africa, because they knew the languages. They knew the geography. And they could help him to negotiate Central Africa. Yeah, they're very important. And they did that. And when he died in Africa, it is these African men and others who were able to embalm his body so it didn't decompose, to collect up all his research and his information. And they took it to the coast of Africa. And some of them wanted to come to Britain, but because of the British Empire and racism, they didn't want it to be seen that the African people could possibly be capable of doing this sort of thing, saving our hero, Dr. David Livingstone, his body and all his artifacts. So in the end, though, they were 2 men. These 2 men were allowed to come over to this country. There were funds found to bring them over to this country. They stayed in the vicarage of this church. The vicarage, let's have a look. The vicarage, or parsonage as it was called, was just there. They came here, they were in the choir as well. They took part in the choir. And they helped a man called the Reverend Horace Waller, who was the vicar at the time, to put together and publish the diaries of David Livingstone. Now, David Livingstone is not as well known now as he was then. Then he was a great hero of the British Empire, this great explorer, this great man who was converting people to Christianity in Africa and against the slave trade and things like that. But he was quite influential in this area. So hence Livingstone Road, Livingstone Towers, all that sort of stuff. So they're very important, and they're now recognized as geographers. And so they are now called geographers. And that's really important. So I think we're going to get a plaque of those two men. And we're going to bring it up to date. So we're going to have photographs of them in the plaque and see it. And same thing with Princess Anna. We'll have a plaque probably up here with her picture, probably that nice one you saw with her dressed in her wedding gown or whatever it was. Up there too. Okay, so that's interesting. It's that kind of history we don't normally know, and realize that, you know, we talk about migration not being a new thing, but there were African people here before the 18th century, but certainly in the 19th century, we know there were African people here, staying here. So that's something we all should be aware of. You know, when people are saying, oh, they weren't here, didn't live here till the Windrush. Had these people not helped him in Africa to explore, he wouldn't have found half the things he found. Had they not brought his body back with all the research material, he probably would not be as well known as he was then. So it is very important, the work that they did. So that needs to be recognized as well. Okay, so that's that bit. We're going to move along. If you look carefully, it says London City Mission Station. So these missionaries, they didn't just go to Africa and to Asia to spread the Christian message. They also felt it was important to do it here, because now you had this very working class poor community living here, and they could see the poverty, and they felt that, right, we want to convert them to Christianity, but we have to help them with the practical things that they haven't got. So it would be perhaps access to education, so a Sunday school, access to jobs, to helping them get jobs and things like that. That was what they were working on, but ultimately they were about trying to convert working class people, what they felt was back to Christianity. My family from the Caribbean, Barbados, and we see signs up that say, backsliders, get back to God. So you can see how that Christianity worked. They took it with them to the Caribbean, but it was a good way of controlling people. They could control their behavior and how they behave, because using the Bible, etc. But it could also be used against them, because some people might see it as more of a revolutionary thing, the Bible, and they could interpret it in that way. We've got Mohammed Khan Road here, which was named after the first Asian councillor of the borough of Waltham Forest. He was one of the men behind the mosque. It's called the Leytonstone Islamic Association. They say that they are the first formally established masjid. Ah! I'm not trouble. I'm doing a good thing here. Hi.
Long time.
I know, it's a long time. You're growing a beard. That's how long ago it was. I knew this guy because he was a youth worker at some pastors. So I knew him well. I'm doing just a guided walk to celebrate the diversity of the community. And so what's interesting was originally this was called the Eliot Rooms, because Mrs. Eliot donated the money to St. John the Baptist Church, and they built a church hall here. This was a church hall. You can tell when you go around the side, it's a church hall. You can see that. Obviously, imagine it. If you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, you're migrating to this country, there are no places of worship. So you worship in your home. So originally, if you were Jewish or if you were Muslim, you would pray in people's homes. And then once you became established, you would be using places like this. And that's what they did. They did a deal with St. John the Baptist Church, and they used this as a prayer hall. And they would do their prayers here. And they would have a madrasa here as well. They hired the hall out for Salah. So in 1974, they actually purchased the property. But they were founded in 1969. But they purchased it in 1974, and they then redeveloped it into what it looks like now.
Come in, show you around, and then.
And we're okay.
Can't hang around him.
No, we can't.
We're on a time walk.
We're going to be led by you. Let's go. I think it's worth it to have a look inside. Let's go and have a look inside.